So I'm going to talk about the nodes now. I did include them in each of the descriptions of each one of the planets, so you can hear that as well. But I'm mainly going to talk about the nodal axis, and especially when the nodal axis falls, like in the 1-7 axis, when it falls in the relationship axis, and in anyone's natal chart, wherever the nodal axis is, when the nodal axis, like in an individual's chart, interferes with the 7th house ruler, Rahu or Ketu with Venus, which is the Karaka. These things are, really bring the sort of unusual flavor into relationships and, shows how we can be affected and confused in our relationship. So when you get Rahu in the 1st and Ketu in the 7th, it's probably the most difficult place for relationship as far as one of the nodal axes is concerned, because Rahu is very much about developing ourself, and Ketu is where we're withdrawing from something. So when Ketu's in the 7th, we're withdrawing from the compromise needed to make a relationship work, which is what the 7th house is, and putting all that attention instead on the qualities of the 1st house, which can definitely be sort of narcissistic at times. Because when Rahu is in the 1st house, the person is developing their own identity, aside from the reflection that comes back to them, aside from what anybody says about them, which is what relationships are. The relationship is constantly someone else telling you who you are, reflecting back who you are. And Rahu basically says, no one decides who Rahu in the 1st says, no one defines who I define who I am. You can look at my videos on Rahu and Ketu to see that Rahu in the 1st, Ketu in the 7th. Rahu in the 1st is developing our identity based on how we define it. Only the Rahu in the 1st person defines themselves, beyond all the roles they have to play. And the 7th house is the biggest role. It's just others in general. So Rahu in the 1st, Ketu in the 7th in general can be disruptive, where the person has to have relationship on their terms. It can definitely make for self-absorbed kind of nature that's hard to compromise, because other people come in and Ketu is there saying, you're wrong, you don't define who I am. What you're saying isn't right. It's not so easy, right? When Ketu's in the 1st and Rahu in the 7th, it's surprisingly opposite. Ketu in the 1st, Rahu in the 7th, and the person will often be sort of, they're very amenable in relationships. In fact, they can be sort of like a chameleon, sort of changing depending on who they're associating with. They can be very accommodating to other people's views, because that's what Rahu in the 7th is trying to do. He's trying to compromise and accommodate what others say and how others define them. But they can lose themselves in that, because Ketu is in the 1st, they're losing themselves. They're critical of themselves. They're negating themselves, which is Ketu in the 1st. Rahu in the 7th is saying, you define me. I'm whatever you say I am, or I can at least try to be that. Rahu is where we're developing that thing very quickly, and we try whatever happens in that area of life. So with Rahu in the 1st, whatever I say about myself, well, I think that's it, so that's what I'll be. I define it, though, when Rahu's in the 1st. Rahu in the 7th is, you define it. Okay, I'll try this. Now, something else to really understand about the nodes, and it kind of is not honored as much as it should, is that the nodes mature in our mid-40s. You might as well say 45. 44, 45, 46, when people hit those ages, you'll often see a kind of crises in their life. This is kind of I kind of refer to the sort of midlife crisis a little bit, when the nodes return the second time, 2.5 times. I don't know whether that's the coincidence or what, but that second time that the nodes, this 2.5 times that the node returns, that's when it really matures. That's after that time. So they say around 45, 46, mid-40s. So the nodes are about 18.5 years, something like that. So every 37 years, and then when someone gets around, about 9 years after that. So when people get 45, 46 years old, and the opposite end of the node comes back for the second time across the natal node, you'll see after that usually the nodes mature. So after mid-40s, wherever the nodes are, it starts to calm down in the person's psyche. So if the nodes are really interfering with the relationship axis, you'll see that they'll work through a lot of it after that or during that time. Wherever the nodes are, by the way, not just in a relationship axis, but wherever the nodes are around that time, often the person will start to work through it. It's in the West, it's kind of called the classical sort of midlife crisis or something like that. So if someone has it in their natal chart in the 1st or 7th house axis, you'll see it'll be a big theme at that time. Confession, I actually have Rahu in the 1st, Ketu in the 7th. So, so that mid-40s coincides with that 2.5 cycle Rahu axis, 2.5 cycle Rahu transit. So anyone who was born, let's say, with Rahu in Pisces, like 48 years ago would be getting that, 47, 48 years ago would be getting that transit right now. Because Ketu is in Pisces. So Rahu would come around once, Rahu would come around twice, which would be about 36, 37. And then the second, and then 2.5 times, when Ketu goes over it, it would show it. So you always need to bear that in mind. So if someone has a really prominent relationship axis with the nodes in the 1st or 7th house, whichever one it is, will cause imbalances. After 45, 46, 47, look and see for that transit. If it's happened, you'll find that thing will calm down. They'll be less motivated toward either end of the node. Now, I said that it can actually keep relationships together when Rahu is in the 7th house, which is true, but it can still be very confusing because the person often will be incredibly selfless and sort of give themselves over to the relationship. When you get that Ketu in the 1st, Rahu in the 7th, there could be a lot of confusion about themselves. The other thing, when you get this Rahu Ketu in the 1-7 axis, especially if you get Rahu in the 1st, Ketu in the 7th, it's better for a woman because women can tend to be more selfless in relationships. So when Rahu is in the 1st, it can actually give them, you might say, a healthier identity. Again, it's a confusing one though. It's confusing to say that it's healthier, but at least it gives an identity that's strong. It might disrupt it though, because women tend to want to surrender their identity in relationship, not their identity, but they want to surrender to the feminine, and it's harder to do that often when Rahu is in the 1st, because Rahu in the 1st is about developing our personal identity. So as a principle, when it's in a man's chart, because men are already more individually motivated, Rahu in the 1st can maybe be more disruptive than Rahu in the 1st for a woman. Again, these are archetypes, stereotypes. No need to make it more than it is. It's just a tendency. So again, not saying that women want to lose themselves to a man or whatever. I'm just saying that in a general sense, it can be more exaggerated. If the man has the Rahu in the 1st, it can polarize things in a way that's not necessarily harmonizing with the tendency. So this kind of goes against the principle I was saying before, because I keep affirming the principle of masculine and feminine, but I would say that in where it concerns the nodes, I've found it to be less disruptive when Rahu in the 1st, Ketu in the 7th is with a woman, more disruptive when Rahu in the 1st, Ketu in the 7th with a man, and the reverse. When you get Ketu in the 1st, Rahu in the 7th for a man, it can actually be more beneficial than Ketu in the 1st, Rahu in the 7th for a woman, because again, women tend to lose themselves anyway in a relationship, and when Rahu is in the 7th, they really tend to lose themselves. So you can see how the nodal axis can distort this gender principle that we've been talking about the whole time in a way that's not desirable. Because usually, every principle I've been saying, you want to try to keep that masculine-feminine principle intact. With the nodes, I'm saying it's actually opposite. So, and again, you want to look in an individual's chart to see if Rahu is interfering with, or actually any planets that are joined the nodes are going to bring out its gender. So this is another important principle, and this is either node. Rahu joined the Sun, Mars, Jupiter is going to bring out more of a masculine quality. The person will have a strong masculine nature. Again, whether it's a man or a woman. Rahu joined Venus or Moon, it's going to bring out the feminine quality. That includes Ketu also. Be more feminine quality. Okay? And again, it'll be a different Rahu. The way Rahu expands the gender is more, more externally. It'll push out the masculine nature, push out the Sun, push out Venus. K2 will make it more of a kind of implosive force, but it's still there. So you would say it's kind of like the strong silent type for the man, or the kind of smoldering internal power of a woman whenever the node, whenever the node joins a gender planet. So if it joins a gender planet, it's either going to blow it out, which is Rahu, or make it a very internal concentrated force that, could be something that you only see. Like for Rahu, again, this is just the principle of Rahu and Ketu. With Rahu, you'll see it externally a lot more. With Ketu, it'll be more internal, and you won't necessarily see it unless you get to know the person really well. And again, this is just a general principle, but along relationship lines, it's definitely true as well. And again, so if a man has, let's say man has Ketu moon, okay? It's going to show a deep inner emotional sensitivity, but it's very deep, and it has to do with, there's a deep inner feminine capacity, a deep inner, capacity to hold feeling on some level, although it might not be so easy for them to enjoy it, and all those things with Ketu. Even, whether it's a man or a woman, right? So it'll be internal. If it's Rahu moon, it'll be more expanded. It'll be more noticeable. It'll be more expressed. Okay, so this is just the nature. And again, you'll see like a woman who has Rahu moon or Rahu Venus. It'll be her sexuality could be very outward. A man too. But again, because men are less about their Venus, men are more about Sun, Mars, Jupiter as far as masculinity, Rahu Venus for men will still push out their attractiveness because Venus is about attraction, but it's not going to be as much of an identifying factor with the man because men identify more with their masculine planets. So this is just a general principle. And I talked about Rahu in its relationship with all the other planets before, so you can go back and look at that rather than me going Rahu Ketu with Sun, Rahu Ketu with Moon. I've talked about them in the other videos, so you can go back and watch the other videos for that. This is just particularly about the nodal axis, the general influence of the nodes on gender and on relationships. And I wanted to make just a special video about the nodes because they are certainly interesting as it comes to relationships. We often have a lot of nodal interaction because they have to do with karma, past and future. So when you see the nodes, the confusion of the nodes through synastry when it interacts with any planets, it can be stuff that we're not conscious of, that's hard for us to understand. You definitely see a lot of it though. You definitely see a lot of the deep glue that keeps people going with the nodes in synastry. And I don't like to get into all the past life stuff, but you could certainly infer that. I don't like to get into that so much, but I think it's probably true, especially with Ketu. Ketu, we're finishing karmas. Maybe we had past life connections with these people. Rahu, we're developing karma. Maybe we're starting a new cycle of karma with that person. All that stuff you can infer, but I don't really like to get too much into that. So, nodes, of course, very important as they interact with Venus, as they interact with the 7th house ruler for either one of them. Like, again, if you're looking at the nodes through synastry, maybe it's Rahu, Mercury, okay? And you're like, okay, well, let's just join Mercury. That shows, like what I said with Rahu, Mercury. But what if Mercury is the 7th house lord for one person? Like, let's say it's a Pisces person. Well, Mercury is not just Mercury, which shows where it's going to expand their ideas and their communication, but Mercury is the 7th house ruler for one of the people, or the 1st house ruler for one of the people. You always need to keep in mind the nature of what the planets rule. This is why in these kind of videos I can give indications, but all that other stuff is also very important. All of those factors are just as important as the button that the planet pushes, but what I'm talking about in synastry are the buttons that are getting pushed, especially one planet on top of another. In the next video, I'm going to talk about aspects, though, through synastry as well, because they also have a place in the whole thing.